Did you know that Nihon Falcom were massively influential in the creation of The Legend of Zelda? Well, stick around, because today I am looking into the forming of this company and how their vision and ambition would go on to inspire some of the biggest video games in the world today. Nihon Falcom, founded by Masayuki Kato in 1981, and is known for popular franchises such as the Ys games or the Trails games, but it has its roots planted firmly in the creation of the modern JRPG. Fun fact, Falcom was actually named after the Millennium Falcon, with con just changed to com for computer. Or some actually say it's com for like .com. Masayuki Kato. Born in 1946, Kato was working in Bangkok when he was introduced to the Apple II computer. He was so impressed that he purchased one and started making games for his son by using the codes of games printed in computer magazines at the time. He went on to open an official Apple retail store called Computerland Tachikawa in 1981. This store would attract many early programmers who came together with Kato to create Nihon Falcom, one of which was Yoshio Kiya. Panorama To, a game released for the PC-88, which was a home-bit computer that Falcom specialised in at the time, and it was a game created by Yoshio Kiya. It was about surviving on a deserted island with a full day-night cycle and survival mechanics. I mean, the game was incredibly ambitious for its time, which is something Nihon Falcom would become known for. Supposedly it was very much of a philosophical story, but there's actually quite little information available. It is cited as possibly the first ARPG, introducing real-time combat, and the base of this game would go on to become what Yoshio Kiya is known for. Falcom's first big hit in the market, Dragon Slayer. Dragon Slayer. Created, as we just said, by Yoshio Kiya, who, as you can see, was becoming a very influential member of the company this time. It took what they had with Panorama To and laid the foundations of what an ARPG would be and what it could be. It was a massive success in Japan. Dragon Slayer abandoned the usual turn-based battles for the time for a real-time hack-and-slash combat. This style would go on to inspire Falcom's own Ys series, but also games such as Dragon Quest, known as the first true JRPG, and The Legend of Zelda, both of which would release 2 years later in 1986. Dragon Slayer was a dungeon-crawling ARPG that introduced the item-based puzzles and item management, something you might be familiar with in games like The Legend of Zelda, where you need a certain item for a certain dungeon. It's known for being massively complicated and difficult, so whilst incredibly important in the history of games, it's definitely not an easy game to revisit in 2026. Xanadu, Dragon Slayer 2. A year later, in 1985, Kiya would make Xanadu, which also held the Dragon Slayer title, but it is important to mention that Kiya used the Dragon Slayer title for a lot of his games, but they actually had no real relation to each other. Xanadu brought with it much more RPG staples, such as character statistics and an overarching quest. It introduces platform jumping, magic, and a morality system called Karma, which would affect how easy it was to level up. Kiya pushed the systems to its limits. He tested how much data he could fit onto a disc and fit as much into the game as he possibly could. This game was also the first work of composer Yuzo Koshiro, who went on to compose for the early Ys titles, Streets of Rage, Super Smash Bros, and much, much more. Most recently actually working on Mina the Hollower. Selling more than 400,000 copies, Xanadu established Nihon Falcom as a mainstay in the Japanese video game industry. Dragon Slayer would see several sequels, but the most important one would come in 1989. Dragon Slayer, The Legend of Heroes. The very first title in the Legend of Heroes franchise, a franchise you might be familiar with known as the Trails or Kiseki games. The first 2 Legend of Heroes titles kept the Dragon Slayer precursor, but after that it was established as its own series. So whilst early Legend of Heroes titles are detached from the massive overarching story that started in Trails in the Sky, they are still interesting, as it was Falcom's first real turn-based RPG. Before this, they'd predominantly focused on ARPGs like the original Dragon Slayer and Ys. The Legend of Heroes wouldn't really hit its stride until the Trails series in 2004. That is despite the Gagarv trilogy releasing from 1994 to 1999. This trilogy exists as a kind of middle child of the series. It had mostly mixed reviews and suffered from a mix of Japan-only releases as well as name confusion when the titles did come west. For example, when the second game, A Tear of Vermilion, came to the West, it dropped the number and was simply The Legend of Heroes. Yet when they finally released the first game, that received the title The Legend of Heroes 2. That is despite being known as The Legend of Heroes 3 in Japan. But before we move on to talk more about the Trails series, let's take a little jump back in time to the start of Falcom's other well-known series. Hi there! If you've been enjoying this video, you may have noticed that this is a brand new channel. What that means is I'm still looking for what kind of content people want to see on it. So if you've been enjoying this content, do think about subscribing. It helps me know that people want to see more videos like this, and that's where I can put some focus into. So thank you for the support. Let's get back to the video. Ys 1 and 2, Ancient Ys Vanished. Developed for the PC-88 by Masaya Hashimoto and Tomoyoshi Miyazaki. The first game that would give us Adol Kristen. Ys built upon what worked with Dragon Slayer, and created a kind of RPG you just couldn't get anywhere else. The real-time action of the game had several bonuses, one being a greater sense of involvement, but the second being speed. The speed of battle greatly reduced the grind that JRPGs were notorious for at the time. It was received extremely well, popular amongst gamers and critics alike. It was hailed for its soundtrack, composed by the earlier mentioned Koshiro Hashimoto, as well as composer Mieko Ishikawa, who would go on to compose Ys 3 mostly by herself. It's considered to be highly influential in the development of video game scores. But again, we see the ambition of Falcom hit a wall. They wanted to tell a more in-depth story than what was really possible at the time with the style of games. As such, the story was split into two separate games, Ys 1 and Ys 2, the final chapter. Something Falcom would soon become a fan of doing, they split the story into two different games, but it is also why Ys 1 and 2 are now always sold as one complete game. Ys would really hit its stride with Ys 3 and 4, both of which received ports on modern software, with those games introducing more ARPG staples such as attacks being tied to button presses rather than happening automatically. This video, however, is more of a look at how Nihon Falcom started, and how in turn their biggest franchises were initially developed and the impact that they had. As such, I won't be going into further detail on the later Ys games, or any Trails games past Trails in the Sky second chapter. If that is something you're interested in though, please do let me know in the comments and I'll look at making separate videos for the series. But, speaking of Trails, Toshihiro Kondo. Remember when I mentioned the Legend of Heroes Gagarv trilogy and how it was a bit of an awkward stage for the series? Well, it was, but it accomplished one massive thing that would ripple through the company for years to come. It drew the attention of a man named Toshihiro Kondo, a college student who became such a big fan of the Legend of Heroes 3 White Witch that he would go on to create a fan site called the Saga of Terraswheel in June of 1996. This website garnered so much attention that Falcom themselves had to pay attention, and would eventually go on to hire Kondo as a web designer for the company in 1998. From there he transitioned from web designer to a project manager, where Kondo would be placed in charge of directing Falcom's next installment in the Legend of Hero franchise. Trails in the Sky. Released originally in 2004 for Windows in Japan, later being ported to the PSP in 2006. Trails in the Sky would take all of the interesting storytelling that made Kondo fall in love with the Gagarv trilogy, and combine it with an engaging battle system that would start simple, but have very interesting depth and creation with it. Kondo's love for the world building of these games are what has stood out over the years. Every NPC you encounter has changing dialogue throughout the story, often having their own character arcs that you could entirely miss if you didn't stop to explore every nook and cranny of the world. The commitment to the characters and storytelling is what the Trails series has become synonymous with, but it's also what almost killed the game before it could get started. At this point, we are well aware of the ambition that Falcom have going into a new game, but it has never been as clear as now. Speaking in a Push Square interview, Kondo was quoted saying, "About 2 years into development, our founder, Kato-san, was asked how far along we were, and I told him we were about halfway done." In response, Kato told Kondo to release what they had made so far, effectively meaning the story was going to end at the halfway point. Kondo then had to decide how to do that, with the threat being that the second half would only be made if the first half performed well. Now, I don't want to spoil anything, especially now that these games have been remade and are fantastic, but this limitation created one of the strongest cliffhangers in video game history. Proof that limitations can breed creativity. First chapter would go on to sell well in Japan, despite it being one of the slower paced, more basic games in the series, the character writing being a real highlight. This meant that Trails in the Sky's second chapter would release, and the following success would cause the Trails series to spawn 11 sequels to date, and Kondo, who would stay the director of the Trails games until the Cold Steel saga, would become the president of Nihon Falcom in 2007, a role he reprises to this very day. I was originally going to talk about the game's initial rocky start to life when they eventually arrived in Western countries in 2011, but there's a longer story there with the localization and issues that were due to Falcom's ambition, so I'll save that for if I do a full video on just Trails. Ultimately, Nihon Falcom will go down as one of the most influential gaming companies of all time. Regardless of if you enjoy their current games in Trails or Ys, their impact on the landscape of gaming and influence in some of the most well-known genres and games, such as The Legend of Zelda, cannot be understated. Falcom's ambition underlines everything the company has been involved with. And that risk to create something real to yourself is something we can all learn from.